In this episode, we're going to tackle one of the most important and most misunderstood ideas in risk management: risk appetite and risk tolerance, specifically for AI. Beginners often hear these terms and assume they are just fancy ways of saying how risky something feels. But in a real organization, appetite and tolerance are meant to guide decisions in a consistent, defensible way. They help leaders answer questions like how much uncertainty we are willing to accept to gain value, what kinds of harm we refuse to accept, and what safeguards must be in place before we rely on AI in high-impact settings. Without an agreed risk appetite, AI decisions tend to swing wildly depending on who is in the room, what crisis is happening, or how exciting the technology sounds. Without clear tolerance limits, teams cannot tell when a system is drifting into unacceptable risk, and leaders cannot explain their decisions to auditors, regulators, boards, customers, or employees. The goal is not to create perfect numbers, but to create shared boundaries that leaders can defend with logic and evidence. By the end, you should be able to explain appetite and tolerance in plain language, understand why AI makes them especially important, and recognize what it looks like when an organization sets them well versus poorly. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Let's start with a clean, simple definition of risk appetite. Risk appetite is the overall amount and type of risk an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its objectives. It is a broad statement of the organization's stance, like whether it is conservative or aggressive in adopting new technology and what kinds of harm it prioritizes avoiding. Appetite is about direction, not precision, and it should align with the organization's strategy and values. For AI, appetite might reflect how strongly the organization is willing to automate decisions, how much uncertainty it will accept in predictions, and how it balances efficiency against fairness, privacy, and safety. The key is that appetite is a leadership-level choice because it reflects the organization's identity and priorities. If a company's strategy depends on trust, its appetite for opaque, high-impact automation should be low. If a company operates in a heavily regulated space, its appetite for experimentation with sensitive data should be low. Appetite is the big-picture answer to what risks we are willing to take and what risks we are not. Risk tolerance is closely related but more specific, and beginners should think of it as the boundary lines that translate appetite into action. Tolerance is the acceptable level of variation or risk within a particular area, process, or system. While appetite is about overall posture, tolerance is about measurable limits that teams can use to make decisions and trigger escalation. For AI, tolerance might involve limits on error rates in high-impact decisions, limits on false positives or false negatives, limits on performance drift, or limits on fairness disparities between groups. It might also involve tolerance for types of use, such as allowing AI to draft internal content, but not allowing it to make final decisions about eligibility or safety actions. Tolerance can be expressed as thresholds, conditions, or rules, and it often differs by context. A system used for low-impact workflow suggestions can have looser tolerance, while a system influencing financial or health outcomes needs tighter tolerance. Tolerance is what turns leadership intent into practical control. Now let's explore why AI makes appetite and tolerance harder and more necessary than in many other technology areas. AI systems often behave probabilistically, meaning they are not perfectly predictable, and they can degrade over time as the world changes. AI systems can also create harm in ways that are hard to see, like subtle unfairness or slowly increasing errors that do not trigger immediate alarms. AI outputs can look confident, which can cause humans to rely on them more than they should, making small model issues become large business harm. AI systems also involve data in ways that raise privacy and compliance concerns, especially when personal or sensitive information is involved. All of these factors mean leaders must be explicit about what level of uncertainty is acceptable and what safeguards are required. If leaders do not define appetite and tolerance, teams will default to convenience and speed, and that default often expands risk quietly. AI requires intentional boundaries because the temptation to scale is strong and the consequences can be high. A helpful way to make appetite practical is to break it into types of harm the organization cares about, such as money, safety, trust, and law. Leaders might have a higher appetite for financial risk in experimental internal tools, but a low appetite for trust damage caused by unfair customer decisions. They might have nearly zero appetite for safety risk, even if the use case promises efficiency. They might have a low appetite for legal exposure, meaning they will not accept AI systems that cannot be explained or documented in a way that meets obligations. When you anchor appetite to harms, it becomes easier to discuss without sounding abstract. It also becomes easier to explain why two AI use cases should be treated differently even if they use similar technology. A customer-facing system that influences rights should be held to a stricter posture than an internal note summarizer, because the harm profile is different. Appetite is about what kinds of harm the organization is willing to risk and under what circumstances. Tolerance is where you translate that posture into boundaries for decisions and operations, and there are several practical forms tolerance can take. One form is performance tolerance, which sets limits on how wrong the system can be before action is required. Another form is fairness tolerance, which sets limits on disparities in outcomes between groups or contexts. Another form is operational tolerance, which sets limits on downtime, instability, or unpredictability in outputs. Another form is data tolerance, which sets limits on what data can be used, shared, or retained. Another form is decision tolerance, which defines where AI can make recommendations versus where humans must make final decisions. You do not have to memorize these categories, but you should understand the pattern. Tolerance becomes real when it is tied to specific conditions and triggers. If there is no trigger for action when a limit is exceeded, tolerance is just a slogan. In mature organizations, tolerance links directly to monitoring and escalation. Beginners often worry that tolerance requires perfect numbers, but the real requirement is defensibility, not perfection. Defensibility means leaders can explain why the boundaries make sense, how they were chosen, and how the organization monitors and enforces them. Sometimes defensibility comes from industry expectations, regulatory requirements, or internal values like fairness and safety. Sometimes it comes from pilot results, where the organization learns what performance is realistic and what error patterns look like. Sometimes it comes from comparing impact levels, like setting tighter tolerances where harm is severe. The key is that tolerance should be set intentionally and reviewed regularly, not guessed once and forgotten. AI systems change, data changes, and business environments change, so tolerance should be revisited. A leader who can explain the logic of the boundaries, even if they are not perfect, is far more defensible than a leader who cannot explain any boundary at all. A common pitfall is setting appetite and tolerance in a way that is either too vague or too rigid. Too vague looks like statements such as "we will use AI responsibly," which sounds good but provides no decision guidance. Teams cannot operationalize that, and it does not help in an audit or incident review. Too rigid looks like setting a single strict rule for all AI uses, which can block low-risk uses and encourage shadow workarounds. Good practice uses proportionality, meaning stricter boundaries for higher impact and more flexibility for lower impact. Another pitfall is setting tolerances that cannot be measured, like saying the system must be fair without defining how fairness is evaluated. If measurement is impossible, enforcement becomes impossible, and the organization is left with debates instead of controls. A third pitfall is setting tolerances but not aligning them with decision rights, so no one has authority to act when limits are exceeded. That creates a situation where monitoring detects problems, but nobody is empowered to intervene. To see how this plays out, imagine an organization considering AI for customer service triage. The appetite might be moderate, meaning leaders are willing to use AI to improve response times as long as customer harm is minimized and transparency is maintained. Tolerance might require that certain categories of complaints, like safety-related issues, are always escalated to humans regardless of the AI output, because the organization has low tolerance for missing those cases. Tolerance might also require monitoring for increases in misrouted cases and triggers for action if misrouting exceeds a certain level. The boundary might state that AI can recommend urgency, but cannot close tickets automatically. These are not technical details. They are governance decisions that reflect what harm is unacceptable. The organization is using appetite to justify the use case and tolerance to control it. This is the kind of reasoning leaders can defend because it ties directly to impact and oversight. Another example might be using AI in hiring-related screening, which has a much higher risk profile because of fairness and legal exposure. Leaders might have low appetite for automation in decisions that affect candidate opportunities, especially if explanations are difficult and bias risk is high. Tolerance might require that AI is used only for administrative tasks like summarizing application information, not for ranking candidates or making eligibility decisions. If any ranking is used, tolerance might require formal fairness evaluation and clear documentation, plus human review of decisions and the ability for appeal or reconsideration. The organization might also set strict data constraints, limiting what data signals are allowed, because some signals can act as proxies for protected characteristics. The key point is that appetite and tolerance lead to a boundary that controls the use case, not just the technology. High-impact contexts often require boundaries that keep humans accountable and keep AI in a supporting role. Because this is an exam-focused course, it helps to notice how appetite and tolerance show up in typical decision questions. If a question asks what leadership should do to guide AI adoption, appetite setting is often a strong answer because it establishes a consistent stance. If a question asks what should trigger escalation, tolerance thresholds and monitoring triggers are often the right direction. If a question presents a high-impact use case, the best answer usually reflects low tolerance for severe harm and requires stronger oversight, evidence, and human involvement. If a question presents a low-impact use case, the best answer may allow more flexibility but still insists on basic boundaries like data protection and documentation. Appetite and tolerance are not just vocabulary, they are decision tools. When you use them, you can justify why one option is more defensible than another. To close, risk appetite and risk tolerance are how leaders turn values and strategy into consistent boundaries for AI use. And they are essential because AI combines uncertainty, scale, and human reliance in ways that can produce serious harm. Appetite is the broad posture about what types of risk the organization will accept and what types it will avoid, anchored to harms like money, safety, trust, and law. Tolerance is the practical set of limits and conditions that translate that posture into operational rules, thresholds, and triggers for action. For AI, these boundaries should scale with impact, be measurable where possible, and connect directly to monitoring and escalation so they are enforceable. The goal is not perfect precision, but defensible decision-making that can be explained under scrutiny. When leaders set appetite and tolerance well, teams innovate with clarity and accountability instead of guessing, and the organization is far less likely to be surprised by avoidable harm. This sets us up for the next episode, where we turn boundaries into practical policy rules about what is allowed, restricted, and prohibited.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.